qui travaillait en arrière de la ligne en France. Translation. I'm very happy to be here tonight to be able to tell you the history of some young Cajuns who worked behind the lines in France and made all of this happen. But I'm particularly happy to be here tonight with this young man, Jason Theriot. If you haven't read his first two books, I strongly recommend that you get these books and read the history in volume 2 of the 156th Infantry, of which this particular unit here in Houma, Thibodaux, Franklin, and all the way over through Abbeville, Brig, Crowley, started out and went to World War II. It's a very interesting history. While he was doing that history, he came to my house. And he wanted me to give him the names of different individuals who had served in this particular unit. Unfortunately, he's the first historian since World War II who became suddenly interested in a very, very important part of the operations in France. What did the Cajuns do? Without the language ability, which we as young people had learned from our families, to be able to translate from English to French for most of the unit commanders in France, one of the first things they look for is, where is Frenchy? Where is Frenchy? I need to get Frenchy. And what they meant by Frenchy was those little Cajun boys. And we were particularly fortunate in America that we're an integrated society. Think about it. We could furnish to OSS in the United States just about any language that people were interested in. Because right here, if you wanted an Italian, you had no trouble finding an Italian in this area. If you wanted a Frenchman, you had no problem finding one in Lafayette. And we did this. And OSS recruited a lot of these young individuals. But he is the first one to bring out what the Cajuns did in the war. We've always been considered peasants as far as the Englishmen are concerned in the American Army. We were the illiterate little boys who were raised in the swamp. You know what I'm talking about. All of you who served in World War II know what I'm talking about. But we proved them wrong. Remember this. In October of 1943 was the first time that a JED or an OG was sent to Washington, D.C. to face Bill Donovan, Wild Bill. 9 months later, they were in France performing these duties. Think about this. How long have we been in Iraq? We still don't have the linguists in Iraq that we had in France, right? We still don't have a post-victory plan in Iraq. We had it in France, and we'll show you what it was. This young gentleman you see here is the gentleman that my wife married. He doesn't look like that anymore. All right. Jason showed you this map, or one similar to this. This is the area of Brittany that we're going to talk about today, and then another area later on. And pardon me if I'm not as articulate as Jason is. He does a beautiful job. If I don't keep knocking this thing. But every one of these agents you see here operated within the Brittany Peninsula, and I'll try to hit the ones that pertain to the Frenchmen here in Louisiana. Of course, I will add on some because of the peculiar circumstances through which they went through in order to accomplish their missions. And the mission was all the same. There were 4 different missions that would First of all, they had to organize the French underground. They had to arm and provide communications to the underground. Once this was done, they had to harass the enemy. They had to do whatever is necessary to be received over the radio. Jason didn't cover it with you, but each one of those radios was capable of talking to Charlie in England. Charlie was the station which handled all of the traffic for all of the JEDs and all of the operational groups and all of the special forces. You had a scheduled radio time to go on the radio twice a day. And at that time, you had to say whether you had a message or no message. If you had a message, you had to send a message. The message was a one-time pad, it's called. It was all coded. There's no way to break it. There was only two of these codes. You had one, and Charlie had the other. We never used the same code. Roy didn't use the same code. Gallagher didn't use the same code, nor did Trumps and Sam. Everybody's code could only be used one time. I'll get this right yet. Okay, Sam West was established by the Parachute Battalion in Normandy, in Brittany, in order to be able to receive these jets when they were flown in and dropped into England, into Brittany. On June the 7th, the SSS Cooney French Parachute Battalion was inserted between Saint-Malo and Van Ness to cut railroads. SAS lost 7 men from the Parachute Battalion was inserted into Brittany to meet with 4 SAS and conduct large-scale operations against the German. Team Frederick, Major Wise, Captain Block, Kehoe were dropped along with 40 SAS people on the edge of the Dassault Forest. Now remember, these were the first ones to go into Brittany, and they had to organize 2 bases in order to be able to operate from. Team George was the other. Captain Hamish came in later, 14 OG sections parachuted into France, and then on June the 25th, General Koenig gave the order to demobilize. He had mobilized them as a result of the D-Day. And when you mobilize them, they went out and started harassing people and harassing the Germans, shooting up the Germans and busting railroads. He gave an order to stop over BBC, and this caused a lot of problems. Special Forces detachments requested in September 1943 were finally approved. And look when we were approved. This was just before we went into France. And this is the Special Forces Detachment, number 11, 3rd Army officers. I'm in the rear. Major Davis is in the rear. Lacoste ended up in the, and he's from New Orleans, Robert Lacoste. I don't know if any of you know him. We haven't been able to find him. Neither Jason nor I have been able to find him. Lieutenant Rutherford Walsh, Bartlett, LaRoe, and I don't know who the other one is. Ripley's another one, and Robichaud is up from the New England coast, and he's also a Cajun, and so is Lacoste. This is what we looked like when we were going in. And these are the ones you've been discussed with you before. Now this is us on a going away party in New York City on the night before we took the Queen Elizabeth to go to England. And these are all Jeds. This is me. This is Major General Singlab. This is Kyle. This is Brophy. This is Kearney. Kearney is part of the Brittany bunch. And this is Dode. This is Harris. And I don't know who this is. Farnsworth. Okay. Team George. Team George was the team that I was told to look for. They were supposed to have dropped in this area. When they were dropped, the Dixon base was raided by the German SS, and he disappeared for 2 solid weeks. And he ended up in Saint-Nazaire in the Loire Inferior. By the way, he also brought, let's see, where's George? I'm going too fast. All right. Am I still going the wrong way? Yeah. Okay, here we go. And these are the Special Forces detachments attached to each army. And this is my team right here. My radio operator, my driver, and my 2 radio operators, my driver and myself. Team Hamish, I won't discuss too much because they were dropped in there. 14 OG sections were dropped in there. And I'll get this thing straight pretty soon. Team Frederick. George. Okay. When I went through here, couldn't find George. Team Frederick was the original one. This is the carpet bag operation. This was the Air Force people who actually handled all of the special operations. And it was a special squadron who flew the missions. Here's where the 4th Army Division captures Coutances, and then we started off and we were operating from there. This is the area which is around this particular area. Captain Felix operated in where you see. Giles was one of the ones who operated in this area here in the Finesta. Horace. Let's talk about Horace a minute. Major Summers was Horace. Horace dropped it down in this area here near Giles and Gilbert. His mission was to go up in this northern area and eventually end up right here. He could have landed up there, but they couldn't have, the plane couldn't fly there because of flak. So they dropped him down here in this area here. And he waited for Giles to escort him. And he waited, and he waited. Finally, he decided he was going to stay there. And 2 people he did not know, didn't have a message, showed up with a truck loaded with wine casks and wine. So they told him, they said, Major Summers, we have to take you up north of Brest, and we're here to do it, and we have 22 hours to bring you there because we have a pass that expires in 22 hours. He said, let's go. So he, his radio operator, and his partner jumps in one of those big wine casks. And they take off, and they cut across this area here to end up to here. When they get here, the guy, but before they get there, they have to cross some of these German towns. They have a flat tire. They're sitting in a wine barrel, and the Germans are helping the driver fix the tire because he told them he had to get that wine over to the Germans as soon as possible. And they're sitting in that wine keg, and they finally get up here, and later on, they help with the FFE in this particular area. And that's Summers. Wait. And I want you to look at this load. This is only part of the load. The other part of the load is the sack that fits on your legs when you jump, right, Rob? And it weighs about 30, 40, 50 pounds. So the sack hits the ground supposedly first, and sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, you go down pretty fast. This is what you see here is a Eureka operator. The Eureka operator is a radio directional signal which the planes came in on the drop zone to make sure that they knew approximately where the drop zone was. And the Eureka was the little radio set you see in his arm here. And this is what a jet looks like when they get ready to jump. This is our team Donald before they went Operational Group Donald. And that's the same kind Roar was. And this is what you look like in the dark when you land. Team Gilbert, they operated in this area here. Jet Team Ronald, this is Trump's. This is your brother-in-law. Ronald landed down here. His mission was to provide the necessary liaison between ALOS, who was the French command headquarters for the entire Brittany, and with all of the teams that were in the Finesta area here. He replaced Team Douglas, who had this mission originally and had to leave because he couldn't find where he was supposed to go. And that's the mission that he was doing. In addition, the team could also furnish information about the units and help organize the Maquis if necessary. They jumped on August the 5th around 3 o'clock. When they hit the DZ, they found a reception committee who didn't even know they were coming. And this wasn't unusual. And they landed on the wrong DZ to begin with. Team Francis landed in the same area. Now, Team Ronald went to Quimper, which is right here. And there were about 1,500 partisans or FFE in this area. And they surrounded Quimper. And when they surrounded, they tried to get, Trump's tried to bluff the Germans into surrendering because the Germans had said they would not surrender to anybody but an American. And he was an American, he was in American uniform. Well, the Germans sent out patrols, and the patrol found out there were no other Americans around, and they knew he was a parachutist, so they refused to surrender. But in any event, they harassed these Germans in Quimper here, to where the Germans started to retreat into Metz. Remember this, that there was about 50,000 Germans in Brittany. And Brittany, they had instructions first to be prepared to reinforce the counterattack force at the Normandy beachhead. But because of the activities of the FFE and the Maquis, they couldn't travel those roads. The railroads were cut, the bridges were blown, and every time they tried to travel in daylight or at night, the FFE would harass them. So their next instructions were to retreat to the port cities to reinforce the port cities. And when they tried to go up there, that's when they started harassing them. Then they moved east. They moved in this area here. They got into a few firefights, and that's where Trump's and his partner was in a second-story building firing at the Germans, And the German, you see, the FFE and the Maquis did not have mortars and artillery. All they had was handheld weapons, and they weren't designed to get into a firefight with Germans. But in any event, Trump's got hit by a mortar here, and he got wounded. But that didn't prevent him from continuing on his mission. He continued on the mission. What's this, Jason? I'm getting mice all over me. I'm pressing the wrong button. He also moved out here to Morlaix and operated in that area, and then he came back down to the Crozon Peninsula.
There you got it.
There you go. Okay. I'm not going to go too much into this. This is what happened by days. The 4th Armored Division, which I was attached to, we came down from Avranches and we decided that we were going to go, we had been instructed to go to Rennes. When we got close to Rennes, and I was supposed to meet an agent in Rennes, when we got to the airport, the Germans had established a pretty strong defense in Rennes. So General Woods, who was the commander of the 4th Armored Division, decided to make a loop around Rennes and go to Ban de Bretagne. And that's where we spent the night. But while we were there, and on this escapade here, I was looking for Guy and Gavin. I had been instructed that I had 3 agents in my area, George and Guy and Gavin. Well, unfortunately, Guy and Gavin, instead of being dropped in this area here, where they were supposed to be operating in the Île-et-Vilaine, they had been dropped way down here. 120 miles off target. And they had been dropped in there 2 weeks before I got to Rennes. It took them 2 weeks to get to where I was supposed to meet them, and they didn't arrive there until the day after I left there. And this is the story of Guy and Gavin. And notice that this is wrong, this is Drew. Okay. They landed way out here. They tried to find some FFE who could take care of them in this area. They finally found a department chief who asked them to stay in the Mayan department. And they couldn't find anything else, and they said, well, why don't you find out if there's anything available for us up in the Côte du Nord, where we should be going. And he said, okay, we'll try. 2 days later, they finally met up with him again, and he said, I got some good news and bad news for you. I said, what's the good news? He said, well, we can find you one spot in the Côte du Nord, but we can't find you any spot in the other. Now these were remember this, there was the FFE, which is the Front Français, Front Français de l'Intérieur, which was the people who were pro-de Gaulle. There was the FTP, Front Tireur, who was the communist-leaning people. And then you had the others who were the Vichy people. So you had Maquis groups of all types there. But in any event, they finally decided that they were going to go here and buy an automobile to be able to get where they were going to go. So they bought one of these old French cars, for 10,000 francs. And a franc at that time was worth about $4. I mean, 400 francs was worth a dollar, somewhere in that area. They took the car, at least they didn't get the car yet. They made the deal, you put the car on the road and we're going to take off in the car. So they got in the car, Drew and somebody else and one of the other guys got in the car. And when they got in the car and they started to drive it off, along comes a German personnel carrier to a screeching halt in front of them. Here's two Jeds in uniform, with weapons, with radios, with everything. So the Germans start questioning them. And as they would ask a question, they would answer in English using expletive deleteds. The Germans finally got tired of this, and they pushed the car off the road, and they drove off. So then they decided they were going to come around, all the way around, and come to Comburg. Sam Broussard. You heard about Sam. Sam joined ALOS. Here's ALOS. This is the carrying area that we're talking about. Before they were there, they were at Mer de Bretagne, which is just to the south of this area. Now, ALOS had quite a few people in it, and they were the command headquarters. Now, Sam and Jason and I are trying to figure out what he was doing in the 3rd Army area. But we finally come to the conclusion that Sam was with the 1st Army headquarters, and when the breakout occurred and Patton's army took over the 3rd Army headquarters, they created the 9th Army and they created an Army group. And probably Sam stayed with the Army group afterwards. But anyway, he was in this area at Cairn. Now remember what Jason told you. This is the area which Task Force Area A was going in. The mission of Task Force A was to protect the railroads and the railroad bridges for in case we were able to open any one of these ports, that we'd have a railroad to transport all our supplies on. The 6th Armored Division was to take Brest. The 4th Armored Division was to cut the peninsula. And if possible, see this bay right here? Secure a base here so that we could open a port there if we could not get a port. When the 6th Armored Division started coming across, they were warned by the FFE that there were 200 German paratroopers at Karlax. And this was Karlax up here. Right there. So the 6th Armored Division bypassed this area and continued on. Colonel Eos and his staff parachuted on the 4th of August. And that was the high ground north of Van Ness, right in this area here. I happened to be with Combat Command A at the time that they parachuted in. When we were briefed, we were not told who all of the agents were in Brittany. I didn't find out who had served in Brittany for 30 years after the war. We had been told, do not write anything, do not discuss any operations, and everything else. But in any event, I was fortunate enough to run in to some team members who were in this area. And we was able to get guides and we were able to have them help us taking Van Ness and Lorient. While we were there were 10 American gliders that landed on the airfield at Van Ness. Think about this. Just think about it for 1 minute. What happened to the paratroop divisions? They held them in England. They held them in England and used them at Remagen Bridge. If they would have parachuted one of those divisions right here, we could have got a port. Just one. But they didn't do it. Now, they say that because they had been used in Normandy, they were rebuilding them and they didn't have an opportunity to rebuild them in time. But in any event, those gliders landed in there and they brought in armored jeeps and they brought in ammunition to support the FFE who took over Van Ness. A battalion of the FFE took over the Van Ness airfield and joined the 4th Armored Division to capture Van Ness. We were able to talk them into joining us and attacking Van Ness. CCA of the 4th Armored Division seized Van Ness, seized the bridges aided by the FFE, who had already seized the airfield. After being counterattacked by the Germans from Auray, CCA decided to counterattack and take this out. We proceeded up here till we arrived at Low Chris and made contact with CCB, who was there trying to take Lorient. We couldn't cross because the bridge was broken. The FFE told us that there was a bridge at Pont Scoff, which we could cross. So we headed to Pont Scoff. When we got there, the German artillery opened up on us, and we lost 20 men, 85 wounded, 5 half-tracks, 6 jeeps, 2 trucks, and 2 armored cars. The FFE established a cemetery and buried the American dead, and is still there today. From Pont-au-Son, we tried to see what we could do in Lorient, but Lorient was too heavily fortified. It would have been possible to take Lorient had we had the parachute division and had the Navy been able to support us with offshore batteries. And this is what combat looks like. This is coming through the hedgerow country in Normandy. This is coming through down towards Coutances through the swamp. If you understand South Louisiana, if you want to go to Grand Isle, you have to go down one road. This is what you had between Perrier and Coutances. It was a swamp. And you see the American soldiers' reflection down here in the swamp. This is what breaking out through the walls looks like. And this is the sight you see when we got into Coutances. There we were in Coutances, hitting minefields. But we were fortunate that all of the prisoners were taken over by the FFE, and they were damn glad to do it. They had been under German control for quite a while, and they took care of the German prisoners for us, and we didn't ask any questions. We didn't have any transportation to bring them to the rear, and that's the way it was. And this is the cemetery at Pont-au-Scoff. Jed Donald had the mission of protecting this area right there. See that viaduct right there? The Gilliam Viaduct, and also to join Team Hillary and to help them protect the bridges, roads, and railroads around this area here. When they finally joined up with the American Army, they could not take orders from the American Army. The orders had to come through Special Forces headquarters. But in any event, they got together with the Army, and he put himself at the disposal of the task force. And then he took part in the battles around Roscoff with his FFE. These are some shots that you might be interested in. This is what it looks like in a briefing session. Jason, need your help, Jason? By the way, I'm going to be 84 in November, so excuse me. You went back, Jason? Okay, this is FFE in the field, training, being trained in weapons and cleaning his weapons. This is, here is the FFE in the liberation of a town. And this is on the machine gun in the lower right, left-hand corner, and more machine guns in the other corner. And this is Lieutenant Trumps. He was in Quimper, and that's why I told you about he would only surrender to an American. Then they went down and with Captain Garan of Team Gilbert, they made their way to Respondon. And Respondon is in this area here. Right in there somewhere. Where a skirmish was underway in the outskirts of the liberated city. Then they participated with Blaywick, the FFE, and American tanks in fighting near Conoso. And that's right down there. Lieutenant Trumps was wounded then. I told you about him being wounded. But he continued to operate, and he continued to do his liaison work between ALOs and Task Force A and in the Crozon Peninsula. He left the zone on September the 6th or 7th and arrived in London on the 16th. Team Douglas, I won't cover Team Douglas too much. I don't have that much time. That's up in the northern part up here, Didon, where they helped the 121st Infantry Regiment. This was a battle. The citadel had been built about 300 years ago. It was about 10-foot thick walls, reinforced with dirt in between. And in order to get all of this reduced to smithereens, it was necessary to use heavy bombers, which they could not get, because at this particular time, if you remember, the Avranches counterattack was occurring, and all of the planes were being used there. So they got the engineers and some FFE who were familiar with the fort to go in and see if they could scale the walls and reach the interior court. And that's what I was talking about, that the counterattack was going on back at Avranches, back in here. The Germans were attacking across here to cut us off from the rear. Now remember, you only had, at that time, 40 miles wide. When we went through, there was about 15 miles wide. Patton shoved 2 corps, 6 divisions, and all of the supporting force through this 15 miles wide. And that's a logistical undertaking, right, Hunt? When I told us to Hunt, he couldn't believe it. He says, look, we have problems running a convoy from here to camp. But think of this. This is a combat army running through a space 15 miles wide. But Patton did it, even though he had to stop sometimes and be a traffic cop. Okay, we're not going to get into this because this doesn't have too much to do. Okay, here we go. On August the 7th, I visited with the chief in Rennes. And unfortunately, le curé, the priest, when he gave me the name, he says, son nom est Juteau. And I'm looking for Juteau all over Brittany Peninsula. And I finally get back to Rennes looking for Juteau, and it's Colonel Delaney, who was the commander of the entire area of Britain. And here's this Frenchman, and remember this, the French had planned to do the after-battle recovery of the entire France. And they had a colonel in charge of that department of Rennes up there, who was the civil affairs officer for the entire area. And here's First Lieutenant Robert LeBlanc walking into his office, asking him for some help. And he looks at me. First of all, his aide tells me, what's your business, what you doing here? And I told him who I was from, that I was representing General Koenig. And he said, well, let him in. Well, he didn't have too much time to entertain me, so I figured I better leave. Then I reported back to Army headquarters. When I reported back to Army headquarters, they sent me to the 12th Corps, which had recently been activated. At Abbeville, I reported to the 12th Corps. Here's an incident of Sam versus Bob LeBlanc. Sam, a major, walks into headquarters. Everybody looks at him. A lieutenant walks into the headquarters, and they said, what are you doing here? What do you want? I'm trying to explain to the headquarters commandant the mission that I was on and what my job was. And this is a brand new corps that just come from the beach, and they weren't interested in listening to a first lieutenant. So he sat me in the liaison tent, and he said, when we need you, we'll call you. About 4 hours later, General Cook walks in, who was the corps commander. And he asked the G3, he says, have you seen the liaison officer from Special Forces? And the G3 said, no, sir, but I'm going to check. So he calls the headquarters commandant. He said, I'll get him for you in a minute, sir. So I had to go in there and start explaining what we did for a living. I don't know what he told the headquarters commandant, but anyway, we had a good relationship from then on. The 12th Corps ordered the CCA 4th Armored attached to the 30th, with the attached 35th Division, and General Seabury to take Orleans, and I was sent with him. When we got to the airport, they needed some infantry. So I contacted the closest FFE, and we provided infantry protection for them. And we also provided Patton's right flank protection all the way up the Loire with FFE. Now we're getting into another area of France, and these are the agents along the Loire River, which had been parachuted before we arrived there in these areas. We were ordered to attack Sens. Now here I am, a first lieutenant. The G3 tells me, he says, Lieutenant LeBlanc, pass up a combat command and you'll be with Combat Command A. And I said, fine, sir. So I jump in my Jeep. I got my radio Jeep behind me, and we take off down the road, and we passing tanks, and we passing half tracks, and we passing everything else you want to see. Suddenly, you couldn't hear a bird chirp. And I looked at my driver, and I said, that's unusual. It's too damn quiet around here. We get over the hill, and we come down, we were in Sins. The bridge hasn't been exploded yet, hadn't been destroyed yet. So we crossed the bridge, and I grabbed the local FFE. And I says, can you take them charges off that bridge? He said, no problem. They jumped underneath that bridge, and they took all those charges off that bridge, and here comes the recon right behind me. And they crossed into Sins, and we captured 30,000 gallons of gasoline, which we needed badly in that town, plus a hell of a lot of meat and a hell of a lot of supplies. In any event, we were able to take Sins. On the 24th, the 35th Division at CCB, we had bypassed Montargis to get there. And Montargis was the area where Bruce, Team Bruce, who was William Colby, who was a CIA director later, who they found dead on the river in the Potomac. Now, he was the agent that we were supposed to contact him. When we got by, all right, I'll move on. In order to move on from there, while we were in Sins, the local commander of the department was Colonel Laurent. After we had taken Sins, he come to meet me and he says, I need a parachute drop. He said, I need weapons. I said, fine. We, over a bottle of Dubonnet, we planned this thing and we got a parachute drop done for him. The parachute, one of the parachutes from the drop, I threw in the back of my truck, my Jeep, put it in a satchel and brought it home with me. When I got back from France, before I went to China, my mother took it, looked at it, and in those days, silk wasn't, no, rayon was very, very valuable. And she was an extremely good seamstress. My wife was pregnant, and she needed a christening dress. And this is the christening dress my wife made. Now this is the bridge at Troyes, and I'll tell you more about it. And Team Bruce was south of Troyes. And we couldn't get to him, and we couldn't give him any instructions until we had taken Troyes, and then Colonel Laurent would be able to send runners out in that area to do that. Team Augustus. Team Augustus was operating up in the Soissons area, and they received a radio message to protect the bridges around Charmes. He decided that he was going to go do his mission. He ran into the American Army, and he decided, anyway, I'm going to go do my mission. I'll go get the FFE to protect the bridges. That's the type of people you had in OSS. So he asked the underground leader there, he says, can you provide me transportation? He says, well, the Germans left a cart here, and we can rig it up for you, and you can go that way. So they got in the cart. They got underneath some hay, and they were going through driving rain, and a German tank stopped them. When the German tank stopped them, he searched the vehicle and found the radio, the weapons, and everything else. Well, the whole team was shot the next day. Aubry was up further north. They had a mission to do. And from Troyes, we went to Saint-Germain, Vitry-la-François, and crossed the Marne. Then we went through Saint-Désir and Commercy. When the Army headquarters was at Étampes, we came again into the area where they had parachuted some Jeds. And these Jeds had had a tough time till we got there because the fighting was real heavy at this particular time. And it was here that it was decided to disband the units and move them overseas to French Indochina. Archibald, Philip, and Jacobs, that's a long story about how they were trying to get into Nancy and they never were able to. Nelson Guillot. Nelson Guillot was another one of the Jeds who was parachuted, and he was from New Orleans. And he parachuted into the Ardèche, and he decided they had also been parachuted off target, but they decided to stay in the Ardèche and fight in the southern Ardèche, so they moved to Saint-Étienne. Then they headed for LeBlanc. And that's where they met the 2nd Algerian Spas, who was with the French Army. And then they came back home. This is the people we're interested today. And this is old Operational Group Peg. Roy, Galley, and all of these individuals in here, commanded by Lieutenant Weeks, Paul Swank, and all of these sergeants, and you see them up there. They landed first in a DZ, which was in a canyon. When they landed, they were on the side of the mountain, and if you ever jumped in a parachute, you realize that you got to have both feet on the ground when you hit the ground. When they hit the ground, the equipment was scattered all over, Raw was hurt, and somebody else was hurt. But that didn't stop them from continuing their mission. They then went to Corsonnet to destroy the bridge, the railroad bridge between there and the other town, which they did do. On the 15th, the FFE captured 9 of the Germans at the soap factory, which was at St. Paul. So then they decided that they would attack the soap factory. So they did that. And they also, Lieutenant Swank, Sergeant Galley, and Roy, decided that they would blow the side of a mountain up. Lieutenant Swank was an engineer officer. And he says the best way to stop the Germans coming to attack us is to drop all of the cliff down on the road. So they did this. They blew the cliff. It fell. What they didn't know was that the Germans were counterattacking them at the same time. Lieutenant Swank and Sergeant Galley stayed behind to protect the troops so that they could get out and go. They stayed behind there. Lieutenant Swank was hit. Sergeant Swank protected him, but he was hit quite a number of times, and yet every time they'd hit him, he'd get back up and start shooting till they finally shot him through the head. Sergeant Galley took control and moved the troops out from there, but he got hit at the same time in his arm, I think it is. On the 18th, they buried Lieutenant Swank at Quinlan. And he could tell you some stories about those people in Quinlan, about how happy they were to participate in that funeral. The trucks were not large enough to carry the flowers when they buried this man. Till this day, they still have the respect of the Americans because of what this team did in that area. Next, since they were at Quinlan, they decided to capture the food warehouse. They did. There was enough food there for the entire population for quite a long time. This was German warehouse, and they were able to do it. Then they decided to move to Linox. And they defeated the Germans there in an assault. There was another JED team, SAS team in the area who asked them for help to cut the rail lines across here. So they went up there, and there was a tunnel there. They were supposed to blow the tunnel, but they couldn't blow the tunnel. But they did cut the railroad in 4 places, which stopped the Germans from utilizing that road. They met the French army at Montpellier and the American army at Abbeville, and Galley and Armentor were placed in a hospital there. They were evacuated to Naples. Got tired of waiting around Naples and hopped the ride back to their group when they found out their group was in the area. Does that tell you something about Cajuns? And this, I don't have to tell you what that is. That's the type of gentleman that we work for. We presented you this, and we dedicate this presentation to the members of the 256 Infantry Brigade who are presently in Iraq, and we dedicate this to the members of C Company who lost their lives there. And I would ask you to just bow your head and say a silent prayer for those people. Thank you. That's all I have to say. I hope I've explained to you what these crazy Cajuns did.
That's unbelievable.